The Dream Gate by Marcus Bach. Chapter 1. The wheat was like the people who had planted it. It pushed up defiantly between stones and dried out stump roots. In patches of sand it struggled, stunted but eager to fulfill what the sower had expected of it. In fertile spots it stood resolutely, as if to say, "Give me half a chance. You will see how strongly I put down my roots." Little Mike walked through the field with arms spread wide and allowed the bristling amber tops to caress the palms of his hands. Sometimes he walked on tiptoe. He was keeping his eyes intently on the two sharply contrasted figures striding ahead of him. Always in the lead was the stocky, black-jacketed form of his father, walking possessively, swinging his arms. The stranger, in his blue Sunday suit, was slender and tall. He walked slower and hardly swung his arms at all. The men left a swath behind them that closed up fast. The wheat was alive. It snapped back into place just as little Mike came along to brush it aside with a bold, waiting motion of his bare arms. Sometimes he ran a few steps to catch up with the men, but for the most part he walked as his father walked, owning the earth. Words and phrases drifted back to him, and he wrote them on his mind, adding new knowledge and wonder to his 10 years. "There's been hard work here," the stranger was saying. "I remember 20 years ago when this was all scrubland." Little Mike saw his father snatch a handful of the grain with a strong motion and thresh it between his palms. "If we were all like you, Joshua Volkner," Michael Newman asserted, "this would still be scrubland today." His words cut through the throbbing stillness of the Sunday afternoon and seemed to set the wheat bobbing in a motion of agreement. "I only meant that many a tired back has gone into this improvement," Volkner corrected genially. "Now, if you had machinery—" "We have machinery," Michael interrupted. "Where?" Joshua wanted to know. "A few used pieces. You will not become modernized. You will not come up to date." "No, that would be making a concession to the world. That would be admitting that something in the capitalistic system has value. So you buy a few second-hand pieces in the hope that the curse of newness has at least been taken off." "Hard work and the good life go hand in hand," Michael Newman vowed, brushing the wheat husks impatiently from his hands. Then he pushed his black hat back on his head and set his bearded face in stubborn survey of the wide, undulating sweep of yellowing grain. "From the colony buildings to where we stand is 60 acres, he said shortly. "We redeemed every foot, swamp and timber." Little Mike's eyes traveled over the ripening field to where the cluster of 30 colony buildings stood, irregular in height and shape. They were the mighty fortress about which the pastor often spoke. They were the dwellings of God's people. Some of the houses were old, some were newly built, but they all huddled together as if each needed the other's strength. This was the commune which held the world at bay. This was the Huterian kingdom, whispering its security to little Mike's heart. The 60 acres were but a small part of the commune. If the stranger would walk westward through the yard, he would find 1,000 acres and orchards and apiaries and gardens. Find a place with water and a mill, his father was saying, calling Joshua's attention to where the rough-hewn two-story mill stood in respectful Sabbath silence. You remember how the fathers said that in Russia long ago, find a place with water and a mill. Well, here it is, right here in South Dakota. Michael's words rushed forward with the river. Everything a man wants and needs is here. Must I remind you, Joshua Volkner, that when the fathers came here in 1874, they came without machinery, without the capitalistic system, and without an automobile. The mill had been abandoned. Utilitarian communism made it work. Homesteaders said they couldn't get enough wood for building. The fathers found the chalk cliffs across the river. They were here 75 years ago. They were still here when you ran away from our community in favor of the world. Chalk blocks built the first commune home and the first barn, and there are enough left for you today, Mr. Worldling, if you are thinking of coming back. I am back. Joshua laughed and took off his hat in a gesture of welcome. I am back for a visit. And after the visit, said Michael bluntly, it's back to the husks and the swine. Yes, back to the system, Joshua sighed. See, you are sick of it. Oh, everybody gets sick of it at times, but I dare say you get tired of colony life sometimes too. Never, Michael vowed. Joshua smiled and followed Michael Newman's steps to the edge of the wheat field. Little Mike looked back over the rolling acres. The snug, weathered roof of the old barn seemed to hug the tops of the heavy wheat. The barn was like a huge gray hen, and the roofs of colony houses and shops were its brood over which it kept a solemn, endless watch. He wished that Joshua Volker would look back too at the big sight, but his father was calling the stranger's attention to the deep pits and the gray-white walls of stone on the other side of the river. There's the chalk quarry, said Michael, which God put there for us Utilitarians. And I suppose you still cut the blocks by hand. Why not? Isn't that the way the fathers did? And we haul them over on the ice with a stone bolt just as they did too. Today the Missouri is a river. In winter it's a road. The river captured Joshua's thoughtful gaze and carried it westward until the willows drew a curtain across his view. Then he turned to Michael with a glint of mischief in his eyes. And where does the river rise, Michael? How far does it go? The question struck little Mike with concern. He had thought of the river only in terms of the colony acres through which it flowed. Born within sound of it, wading, swimming, playing in it, watching the men of the commune set nets and haul up fish for food, he had thought of it simply as our river. Did it come from anywhere? Did it go anywhere? If so, did his father know? Michael Newman grunted in disgust at Joshua's question. Then he stopped, plunged his hands into the roomy pockets of his homespun black pants, and stood with legs spread solidly on the slope. Shrewdly he said, if you followed that water from where we stand, here in Old Portage Colony, you would go 1,000 miles upstream, way into Montana State, where it rises, and if you followed it downstream, you would go 1,000 miles also, way through Missouri, where it empties into the Mississippi. Such is the river that waters our land." Joshua smiled. "Well then, you do depend on the outside world. The schoolmaster never told us that in the olden days." Michael Newman replied prophetically, "America is a big country, Joshua Volkner, but we are the seed of a new society. If the river nourishes us, well and good. That does not mean that we must be carried either upstream or down. There are roots that hold us right here, no matter how many thousand miles the waters run." Half hidden and forgotten at the edge of the field, little Mike plucked absently at the wheat heads, while his blue eyes scolded the river for coming such a great distance. 1,000 miles! How far was that? When the town man went beyond the commune grounds to Tabor, that was 5 miles. Yankton, to which the colony pastor or the householder occasionally went on business, was 30 miles. That was far into the world, and no boy or girl in the commune had ever made that trip. The colony truck was strictly for business. The colony gate was opened only by permission. Our river ran 1,000 miles upstream and 1,000 miles down. Could it travel that far in and out of the world and still be a good river? For the world was that wicked place about which the pastor preached every evening and every day when the community gathered for evensong. The world was the dreaded place of private ownership and private enterprise, which were rapidly bringing men to ruin. There was only one true and right way to live, the Hutterian way, the way of the colony, the communistic way. For the first time the Missouri was a stranger and a deceiver. Did it flow through the world of sin and still do the good work of turning the mill's huge wheel? Did it open its own gates and cross strange lands without being punished at all? Could there be other people, and good people too, 1,000 miles upstream and 1,000 downstream, even though they did not live under the Hutterian system? What were they like, and why did God watch over them if needed? He did. Little Mike's truant thoughts were shattered by a stinging blow across his knuckles. His father stood over him, a blunt stick in his hands. "Don't stand there pulling off the wheat. Waste is of the devil." Little Mike gasped, not because of pain or hurt, not because of anger. Nothing his father ever did to him was undeserved. His father was boss, and little Mike understood discipline. The shock sprang out of the frightening knowledge that he had ventured in thought far beyond the commune grounds. He had slipped through the forbidden gate. He had pierced the curtain that hung between the colony and the world. Solemnly he brushed his burning knuckles on his faded blue shirt, then wiped his hands in his tousled brown hair. His eyes grew large with a plea for forgiveness, but his father was already walking away. Little Mike looked himself over as if to assure himself that he had fully returned from his mental flight. He noticed that some of the hooks and eyes on his shirt were unfastened. He fixed them. The visitor's coat had buttons. That made Joshua Volkner different from the men of the commune too. Michael Newman led the stranger along a soggy cow path that ran between the deep ruts of a wagon road. Little Mike walked in a rut so narrow and deep that he had to balance himself to stay in it. His bare feet, scratched by the trek through the wheat field, touched softly against the cool, moist earth. He stopped and rolled up the legs of his Sunday pants, then galloped on. The men's voices lured him on. His father's voice led him, just as little Mike sometimes led the colony pony on the bridle strap. He was tied to his father like that, and it was pleasant, just as it was pleasant to listen to his father's voice and hear so many wise and fearless words. Last night, when Joshua's big black car drove into the commune yard, little Mike had crowded around with the men and the children of the colony. The men who remembered Joshua greeted him. Others held back, as if not knowing what to say, but Michael, father, took the newcomer's hand with the ready words, "Well, Joshua Volkner, is it? Welcome home." Little Mike remembered how those words brought a silence over everyone. They were stern, startling words, spoken with the blunt strength which was his father's way. The stranger dismissed the greeting lightly. "Well, for the little that has changed here, I should surely feel at home," he said. "I wouldn't have known you from a million other men in the world," Michael told him hopelessly. Little Mike gazed at the stranger with serious eyes. Joshua Volkner was straight and tall, and there was a suggestion of calm authority about him that was as strong as the bold manner of Michael's father. None of the men had kissed the newcomer. Pastor Kunz did not come out of his room to greet him, and at the Sunday morning church meeting he made no mention of the visitor, even though the man was at the service. Then after dinner, when the men filed from the eating house, Volkner, in a lost sort of way, walked over to the house bench where little Mike's father and mother had just seated themselves. Volkner said, "I've got a Sunday afternoon on my hands. Have you suggestions, Michael?" Michael's eyes had roved critically over the man. He groaned at the colorful necktie and the clean-shaven face, measured him from his shining black shoes to the top of his summer hat, then turned to glance around the commune, where other families sat on house benches or walked slowly in the yard. Suddenly, Michael Newman clamped his hands on his knees. "I'll show you around, Joshua Volkner, if everybody else is too busy." "Oh, they're not too busy," Joshua said tolerantly, "but you see how it is. I'm the world." "Well, that's not our fault," Michael told him, "and the commune is still the kingdom. Yes, I remember the Sunday laws. No work, no play, no noise or activity. It might be a Sunday 300 years ago in the Ukraine or in Moravia, for all that has changed." "Stop taking pictures of us," Michael said wryly, "or it might be a Sunday right here in Old Portage Commune when I was one of you." "Yes," retorted Michael bluntly, "when you heard the world calling, and you could not close your eyes, when you saw the beckoning finger across the commune borders, and you could not shut your eyes, when you heard the sound of an automobile, and it said, 'You must have one too,' when you turned your back on your people and your God. I wouldn't make it quite that strong." But Michael Newman had already started on his way. Then, without turning his head, he called out, "Little Mike, come along." The joy of these words balanced little Mike now as he walked with a playful swaggering goose-step in the narrow rut. He looked at his knuckles and said, "You don't hurt." He set his feet down with a rhythmic smack. He swung his arms wide and free and gave his shoulders the possessive, twisting motion with which his father walked. "Little Mike, come along." He had wanted to ask, "May I come along, Michael father?" But no boy in the commune ever put such request to his parents. The fathers had a saying, children should keep silent, and that is the way it was. The father's word was law. Over it was the word of the 7 elders and the pastor. Over that was the word of God. Children and women had no voice in these things. Little Mike, come along. The cowpath led into a narrow lane guarded on each side by a sturdy stone fence hung over with wild grapevines. Behind it, currant thickets huddled against an aging poplar windbreak. Michael Newman strode on, but Joshua stopped and cocked his head. Little Mike stopped too, a short distance behind him. He heard the familiar stirring, fluttering sound in the overhanging growth. He heard the nervous whispering of the birds, and he saw Joshua turn and look at him with a glance of friendly understanding. "That sounds familiar," said the man. "You know what we used to call this path, the Vogelpfad." Little Mike's heart leaped. That, of course, was what everyone in the commune called this sheltered corridor, the Vogelpfad, a path where one never failed to hear the birds morning, noon, or night, Sundays, or any day. "Well, come on," called Michael Newman, waiting where the lane led to the meadow. He was taking stock of the huge basin-like expanse, its distant boundary fenced in by rows of trees. "This is something new," Joshua exclaimed as he reached Michael's side. "You've done good work. What the Lord doesn't provide, the hands must make," Michael boasted. "I know," Joshua admitted, "but I remember how gnarled and stubborn the trees once stood here, and how the gravel washed in when the river was high." His words trailed off as Michael Newman stopped on with firm steps and swinging arms. He led Joshua and little Mike forward. The boundless pastureland made Volkner breathe deeply. He spread his arms as if to own some part of what he saw and felt. "Freedom," he confessed. "Notice these clumps," Michael ordered as he strode into one of the generous islands of extraordinarily high and thriving grass that studded the meadow. Good wood chunks came out of bad timber, and even better firewood out of the roots. Where the trees came out, in went grass, and you can tell where the trees once stood by the patches. Every one of them speaks of hard work, and grubbing and planting. Like colony haircuts, these grassy spots look, as if somebody had put a bowl over them and cut them off all the way around with a big shears. Little Mike laughed happily and ran his hand around the rim of his thick brown hair. "And there are the cattle," Michael stated, pointing off into the distance. 300 head, all Angus, as you see." "Yes, yes," marveled Joshua. "After bad years, the good years, shall we see, Michael? I remember the burned earth and the struggles we had when I was here. I remember the time of the cattle disease that cleared the pastures, and the mornings that you and I went out with the cattle boss and the farm boss. They worked with the dying animals and even prayed over them. I remember the winters when it was no cattle, but people we were praying for. Nobody knew that, for the Hutterians always had great pride. No one ever became a doctor or a veterinarian. People or cattle, the problems were always brought to the Lord. I remember the floods and fires and famine and the First World War when they drove our stock from the fields, and that is the world you went into. I will never understand it. What was it you wanted, Joshua? Freedom, Michael, the one-time Hutterian exclaimed. I thought of that when I saw the young people in the commune and heard them singing. Yes, singing they were, but what if they should say, "We want to go out and see how other people live. We want to live our lives as we please. We want to be free to come and go as we please." What then? Wild animals, Joshua Volkner, think they have freedom too, but they have none. The jungle makes them fear every moment. Here we have contentment and brotherhood. Here we are doing God's will. Of course, after 20 years, I do not expect you to remember Scripture, but you can read it any time and find it has not changed. All that believed were together and had all things in common. My wife and I have often discussed the meaning of that text. Your wife and you, and would you please tell me, what does a woman know about these things? Michael swept the question aside in disgust. Where is she? Did she come to South Dakota with you? She is in Chicago with the children. Children? 2. I've got 6. 5 girls and little Mike. So I hear, and I congratulate you on a nice family. Really, we would have 7 children, only that little Sarah died. Yes, I know, Joshua answered, half turning away. The firstborn died, didn't she? You know, Joshua, Michael exclaimed, if you had listened to us, you would not now be wandering lost in the world. Lost, Joshua echoed. I'm not lost at all, but you are not happy. Indeed, I am. No man is happy who turns his back on the truth, Michael told him. No man is happy who chooses the way of private ownership over the way of the commune. He may think he is happy, but in his honest moments he has to say, "It is gone. I've lost something. The world has nothing to make up for it." Have you one really true friend in the world? Come now, tell me. Have you anyone who does not think first of himself, or how he can get something out of you? Have you security and peace? Oh, yes, I know, you have made money, but so did the rich man in the Bible, and you know what happened to him. Oh well, Joshua replied lightly. You Hutterians always picture the world worse than it really is. That, said Michael shortly, is impossible. He walked deeper into the pasture, swinging his arms. Well, he exclaimed, the land runs to the clump of trees to the north, and to the fence at the south. That pond in the low grass is perpetual. If the cattle boss were here, he could round up the herd for you. Yes, I'd like to see them up close. Little Mike stood near his father in the thick, fertile growth. His eyes lighted expectantly as he watched the black, glistening herd stolidly gazing toward them across the open field. I can get them over to you, Michael, father. So, grunted Michael without looking at him. Are you cattle boss today?" Little Mike felt the touch of gentleness, slight, veiled, suppressed, but welcome as a soft caress. "Not cattle boss, Michael father, but I know the call." The father's bearded face remained expressionless, his hat pulled low over his eyes, his hands stuffed inside the waistband of his pants. He stood as immovable and stubborn as the Angus. A hasty single glance essayed his son's round, eager face, and the tanned arms and legs, which needed only a commanding word to fly into feverish action. Shortly he said, "Well, call them then." Little Mike cupped his hands around his lips and took a deep breath. "Moo-caw, moo-caw, moo-caw." The call swept over the field. The cattle made no move. "Moo-caw, moo-caw." Little Mike glanced anxiously at the unyielding figure of his father. "Well," Michael chided, "I thought you could round them over." The boy looked up, wounded by the hint of censure in the words. He heard again, "Little Mike, come along." He saw Volkner smile as if to say that rounding up cattle was a man's job. Strongly he felt his father's judgment. A man should never boast unless he can fulfill his promise. Leave cheap talk for the world. Say nothing that you do not intend to back up. Such were the commune sayings that rose to torture him and caused him to spring forward with a cry. "I'll get them, Michael father." "Michael," Joshua warned, "don't you think the boy—" "Quiet," snapped Michael. "Moo-caw, moo-caw," Little Mike called as he ran, and the sharp cutting edges of grass under his feet drove him on. He was the cattle boss, riding his horse into the herd. He was a Hutterian doing what the world said could not be done. He was Michael Newman, afraid of nothing. "Moo-caw, moo-caw." The cattle lifted their heads. They stood defiantly in a solid pack, and little Mike instinctively slowed to a walk. Then he stopped and picked up a stone, measuring the distance between himself and the herd. "Mike." His father's voice sent a cold sensation through his body, and his hand tightened over the stone. He dared not turn. He drew himself as tall as he could, breathlessly waiting. "Mike, we don't stone the cattle." The words ran through him, and pride opened his hand. The stone fell to the ground. Once more he realized that his father could see everything. Even before a boy in the commune committed a wrong, the father knew about it. They were like God, they knew everything. There was a tremor in the herd. Through the solid black walls a big steer shoved its massive bulk forward, and stood with its head jutting out, its bulging muscular neck tensed with unleashed power, its legs like rods of iron driven into the soft ground. Little Mike stood with his open hands defenselessly at his side. He took a step. The steer began slowly swinging its head from side to side. Little Mike kept his frightened, breathless gaze on the large, bulging eyes. They were like two glowing coals in the blacksmith's forge. The swinging head made them roll and flame, and every step he took made them burn more fiercely. But something told him to go on. What was it? The cattle boss said, "A steer's natural look is stubborn and mad, but he's tame as the colony dog." "The cattle boss knows," little Mike told himself, assuringly. "He knows and would not lie. No one in the colony lied. No man ever said anything that he did not know for sure." He was close now, about the distance of the swing rope on the riverbank tree. 10 feet. The steer's head snapped up. A rope could not have pulled it up faster. Slowly the beast's front hoofs clawed at the earth. Slowly and threateningly its head swung from side to side. Little Mike held out his open hands. He had no sticks, no stones, nothing. His lips moved. Over and over he murmured his magic prayer, Moka, Moka. The word died hopelessly on his lips. The hot breath of the steer was on his face. Panic seized him, and his heart was begging God for help. He longed to look back for protection to where his father stood. There was a movement in the herd. A sudden swift impulse told him to turn and run, and he choked back a cry of fear. His father must never see what he felt. The magic power of his father's all-knowing must never guess. He forced himself to turn, and as he stood with his back to the herd, he whispered tremblingly, Moka, Moka, come along. He started to walk, praying that the cattle would follow him, but they made no move. Far away, through a mist that was heavy tears, he saw Michael Father standing with hat pulled low over his eyes, hands on hips, legs spread apart. He saw Joshua Volkner at his father's side. Then he heard a heavy thrashing sound behind him and felt a thunderous rumbling break over the ground. Suddenly the onslaught of black bodies swirled around him. Sunlight and darkness passed over him out of the dirt-filled air. The pounding hoofs were like the workmen's sledges breaking the white chalk cliffs. The cliffs were falling over him in the wild stampede. The herd was veering sharply as the black steer led them toward the far end of the basin. When little Mike swung around and saw this, his voice returned. Moka, Moka, he shouted and started running after the cattle frantically. Faster and faster he ran, calling until he stumbled and fell and lay exhausted and weeping in the grass. Slowly the hoofbeats faded away. Slowly out of the silence came the sound of firm, unhurried steps. He looked up and choked back the quivering in his throat. His father stood over him and held out his hand. Hurt? He asked shortly. No, Michael Father, can you get up? I think so. Get up then. Little Mike rose to his feet. Joshua Volkner said, There's blood on his leg. It's a deep cut. But if that's all there is, he's lucky. Michael Newman knelt down. I'll tie my handkerchief around it. A hoof grazed it, or maybe it was only the fall. Little Mike put an arm around his father's shoulders, while the red handkerchief was tied over the wound. They didn't kick me on purpose, Michael Father, he said. The cattle boss always says that if you don't hurt them, they won't hurt you. Well, it's a cut of some kind, Michael shrugged. You'll have many more before you're a man, and maybe some more kicks too. I wanted so much to bring you the cattle, Michael Father, he said chokingly. Why couldn't I? They wanted to go the other way, just like some people want to do. They knew you weren't the cattle boss, so they went where they wanted. They wouldn't have gone the other way if I had really been cattle boss, would they? Can you walk? I think so. Come along then, you can take my hand. His father's firm grip tightened over little Mike's hand. He got up. The bottom of his feet felt torn and bleeding, and every step was painful. But he would say nothing about that. It was bad enough that he had failed in calling the cattle, especially after having boasted that he could bring them in. It was bad enough that his father had seen him lying there with tears in his eyes and trembling. Joshua Volkner said, Well, little Mike, you were a brave one. I see nothing brave about going after some dumb cattle, Michael Newman corrected. especially when they've always been treated good. That big steer, I could collar him right now with one hand and ride him into the commune yard if it weren't Sunday. You Hutarians, Joshua lamented, never show your feelings. Never let anyone know how you feel or what you feel. No, that would be too much like the world. That would be a sign of weakness and an admission that something is wrong with your way of life. You came to see the colony, Michael replied brusquely, quickening his steps. All right, look. Over there is the potato patch and the berry garden, and if you keep your eyes open, you will also see we're going to have some watermelons. We have our own little world every day of the year, Mr. Joshua Volkner, and if you think private ownership is better, go to it. As for us, we'll take our communism and show you what it can do. Little Mike felt his father's hand close protectingly over his. It was the strong clasp of security and guidance. He was hand in hand with the man he loved best and admired most among all men. He was walking through the Vogelfeld, and the birds were singing just for him. Run, Missouri, his heart was saying. Go your 1,000 miles upstream and your 1,000 down, and run, Joshua Volkner, wherever you want to go. There is no better place anywhere in all the world than in the commune, and no better life than the life of the Hutarians. Chapter 2. Little Mike lay in the soft dirt of the commune yard, idly reaching out a hand to rock his baby sister Leah in the homemade cradle. His mother, seated on the house bench, was really rocking the cradle with her foot while she knitted, and little Mike simply let the motion carry his hand along while he sang snatches of a hymn which the colony members had sung at evensong a short time ago. Once more, O God, we near the end of day. The darksome night again is coming o'er us. But thou, O God, dost still go on before us. He paused and raised his head, brushed his hair from his eyes, and looked from the early evening sky to the familiar commune. There's Michael, father, going over to talk to Joshua Volkner. Sarah's eyes lifted quickly like the hasty parting of a curtain, then returned to her long wooden needles. She gave the cradle an accented tap, and with her heavy shoe. We don't always report everything we see. Poor Joshua Volkner, little Mike sighed, and dropped his head back into the dirt. Why poor? He's made a great lot of money, everybody says. Yesterday, when we came from the wheat field, Michael father said he was poor. Little Mike's replied, so he's poor, and no one ever calls him Volkner Joshua, always straight out Joshua Volkner. That shows he no longer belongs in the commune, or we'd call him first by his family name. His sister Rachel came from the house and hastened to Sarah's side. See how I am doing with the wedding apron, Sarah mother, she said happily, holding the apron against her body. Her brown eyes swept the commune. She was looking for David Weiss, of course, and she hardly listened to her mother's comment. She bundled the apron into Sarah's hands and sat down on the bench. She took off her polka-dot headscarf and smoothed it out. Her dark hair was properly parted in the center and turned under to form a neat roll against her forehead. Now she folded the headscarf into its diagonal shape and put it on so that it covered her entire hair, with the exception of the soft roll which framed her forehead. She tied the scarf carefully under her chin and made her look very much like Sarah Mother. But her mother's face was thinner, and her features were sharper, and her eyes did not have the eager light in them. "There he is, Mother," Rachel whispered excitedly. "We're going for a walk." She bounded from the bench, brushing some threads from her long skirt. "Not out of anybody's sight," Sarah warned, "and here, take the apron." "Ruth is coming out soon," Rachel said, hurrying off. "She'll put it back safely into the wedding chest." "Walk decent," Sarah counseled, "and be here before it gets dark." Then she added, "And don't hold hands when you walk together. Don't go outside the commune gate." She fondled the deep blue wedding apron. Little Mike let the accelerated rocking of the cradle shake his hand. Dreamily he looked up to see pink-red sheaves of cloud gilding the colony acres. He rolled his head back and forth on the ground. With this motion he made the commune come and go, appear and disappear. Chalk stone houses, then sky, the big barn, then clouds, the women on the house benches, then endless space. With a slight turn of his head he could make realities vanish into dreams. "You're here to stay, Sarah Mother," he said, gazing up at her. "I won't make you disappear." "Get up from the dirt," she told him. Little Mike did not move. He knew from her tone that she did not really mean for him to get up. If his father had told him, that would have been different. He was glad he was a boy, glad he would be a man in the commune. Men had the say. The man said the Bible, and Pastor Kunz is head of the house. As he tried to comprehend this saying, he studied his mother. Sarah Newman could have leaned against the house, but she would not. She sat upright, knitting. Her fingers were restless. He had often seen her at the spinning wheel, with baby Leah on her lap, making the wheel sing and calling orders to his other sisters at the same time. The man is head of the house. Somehow his mother did not seem to mind. She had a manner of doing things that always seemed to fit in exactly with his father's plans. Her brisk ways and her quick words directed and ruled the household, while Michael Father really thought it was he who directed and ruled it. Sarah, Michael Father would say, "Look at Leah, church time, and you still have to wash her and put her to bed. Anna will do that. Anna's 8 now and has good responsibility. Sarah, my socks. I can find nothing when I want it. They're on the bed, Michael, where you said you wanted them. Sarah, the children put something in my pocket. I told you that if they did a thing like that. That's a sandwich I put there. You said yesterday that you get hungry walking in the timber looking for wood for the cabinet shop. Sarah, we ought to carry in water for the bath. Remind me of these things." Little Mike and I carried it in already. Little Mike smiled when he thought how his mother was always just a little ahead of Michael Father, and yet how Michael Father ran things with authority. The man is head of the house. "I said get up," Sarah repeated. "Go and play with the boys. What's wrong with you tonight, lying there in the dirt, and making believe you're rocking the cradle?" Her voice was always lively, and she had a habit of beginning a sentence loudly and then letting the words fade away. This pattern was always exaggerated when she spoke with make-believe anger, as now, and he hummed the song as she glanced down at him. "Foolishness," she exclaimed in disgust, but behind the word she seemed to be smiling. She sat knitting with the ball of yarn in the familiar honey pail at her feet. Just now she seemed no older than Rachel. The roll of hair turned under at the edge of her head scarf was like that of the older girls of the commune. Playfully he said, "You're pretty, Sarah Mother." "Hush up," she said. "You'll wake Leah." "You look like Michael Father," said he was sure Joshua Volkner's wife looked. Sarah pressed her knitting to her breast and stared at him. "What kind of talk is that?" she probed. Michael Father said he was sure that Joshua Volkner's wife painted her face because she's a woman of the world. And that, little Mike explained, was a hint of gaiety, is just what the sunset is doing to you. You get up or I'll get the strap. But her fingers resumed their knitting, and she put her face lower over her work, weaving her thoughts into the design. "Your cheeks are so pink, Sarah Mother." "Well, it's not paint. Rouge, or whatever they call it." "Rouge," he repeated. Pink and pretty was his mother's face as the sun tinted her high cheekbones and added a touch of color to her lips. Never had he heard his father say that she was pretty. Never did anyone say that anyone was pretty. But as he looked at her, he remembered a picture on a calendar. Pictures were not allowed. But there had been a calendar once in the pastor's room, with a mother holding a baby. Some said it was Mary and Jesus, and the calendar was never seen again. Pictures of people were bad enough, the pastor said, but who would dare to make a painting of the Holy Child? Sarah Mother was like that picture. Her eyes were blue as her head scarf. Her long black dress was almost hidden by Rachel's deep blue wedding apron, which Sarah had spread over her lap. She was slender beneath her full black blouse. Only her hands looked old as she continued to knit and rock, while baby Leah slept. "Ruth," Sarah called, "come and take Rachel's apron." In a moment Ruth and Anna came out of the house and into little Mike's line of vision. Ruth seized the apron with delight and held it against the faded gray apron she was wearing. Her face shone as she asked, "How does it look on me, Sarah Mother?" "Wait 4 more years and I'll tell you," Sarah said with dismissal. "Don't get it in the dirt." "Will I have as pretty a one when I get married?" "Foolish talk," exclaimed Sarah. "Fold it nice and put it in the wedding chest." Ruth hurried into the house. Anna knelt beside the cradle and rocked it gently, giving Sarah's foot a rest. Little Mike locked his hands under his head. His sisters liked pretty things, and so did he. Surely his mother did too, though she made believe that it was best not to admire things at all. Of course his sister Anna was too young to see anything attractive in the apron. She was a few years younger than he. As she bent over the cradle, she looked like a little mother in her polka-dot headscarf and her long black skirt. She was barefooted, and her feet were as dirty as his. Sweetheart Leah, Anna chanted as she nestled her face against the baby. "Now you woke her up," Sarah scolded. "See if she's dry. Don't put her to bed wet." "I'll take care of her. Come, sweetheart Leah, come." She lifted the baby out of the cradle and, crooning over her, carried her into the house. Little Mike rocked the empty cradle, singing, "Once more, O God, we near the end of day. The darksome night again is coming o'er us. Hovering o'er us, Sarah corrected in exasperation. Sing right or keep quiet. Twice you make the same mistake. For the last time, get up from that yard. Little Mike sang happily, hovering o'er us. But thou, O God, dost still go on before us. Both night and day obey thy hand alway. In a high melodious voice, Sarah guided him on. With contrite heart I see night's shadow drawn. Throughout the day the world estranged me from thee, O mighty God. Be gracious in thy judgment. Little Mike up from that dirt. The spot in which little Mike lay swirled with an instantaneous, "Yes, Michael, father," and he was on his feet, brushing the seat of his black pants, hurriedly pulling up the red kerchief that bound his leg and shaking the dust out of his hair all at the same time. Joshua Volkner, amused at this exhibition of discipline, asked gently, "How is the leg today, little Mike?" The boy raised embarrassed eyes. "It never was bad in the first place," he said. "Sarah," Michael announced, "Joshua Volkner stays with us tonight. That means somebody must get the wash basin from wherever it is." "It's already in the room," Sarah informed him without pausing in her work, "with clean water in it." "That's so," said Michael awkwardly. "Well, then it's attended to." "Good evening, Sarah Newman," Volkner greeted her. "Good evening. It's soon too dark for knitting, I would think," he observed. "Sarah can knit in the pitch black," Michael boasted, with an indifferent wave of his arms. "I seem to remember that Sarah did that in the olden days," Joshua began. "Well then, you have a good memory," Michael grunted. Joshua smiled. "Yes, I have, for things that made a special impression, and I find many memories returning now that I'm back in the commune once more." "You were 20 when you left," Sarah ventured without lifting her eyes. "When he escaped," Michael corrected her. "That's what he told us in the letter he wrote." "Escaped? Ridiculous. Does anyone stand at the commune gate with a gun to keep us here? There's a better guard than that. God's will and God's law. You want to escape from that. Then, Mr. Volkner, you'll need a faster automobile than the one you have." Little Mike stood at his mother's side and heard these words with admiration for his father's wisdom. But Joshua bantered good-naturedly. "I was going to say that I remembered how Sarah used to knit long into the dark. You remember, Sarah, I told you once, you'll need glasses before you're 20. I was wrong. You still don't look like 20, but the Stammbaum, that stern genealogical chart, which the pastor keeps, will very likely say that you're— No, that can't be possible." "What can't be possible?" Michael wanted to know. "That Sarah is 38. "Listen to the worldling," laughed Michael. "Age. That's the important thing in Joshua Volkner's world. There everybody must keep young. Women must paint their cheeks and spend their time under hair machines and get their faces fixed by 100 artificial and devilish schemes. Think of it, an everlasting fight to stay young and go against nature. Here we're willing to be honest with time and even help time along. Here age is a blessing. Age brings wisdom and reverence. The Stammbaum may say I am 38, if that is what I am, but my beard can say I am 50 or 60. I don't care. There's nothing worse in the world than the everlasting madness to stay young. Thank God that we Hutarians have more sense. Well, come into the house." He started to the door, and Volkner, with a hesitant glance at Sarah, followed. The knitting needles paused. Sarah picked at a thread and pulled it into place. Little Mike climbed up on the bench beside her, drew up his bare feet, and wrapped his arms around his knees. Children moved in the commune yard. The choremen, with their black hats setting off their stoical bearded faces, came from their jobs and entered their homes, letting the screen doors bang. Soon their wives went in too, calling orders to the children. The pink-red clouds burned themselves out and now hung in the sky, gray as ashes. The light was taken from Sarah's face, as though the heavens were sorry that they had painted her like a woman of the world. Evening spread an autumn haze over the commune grounds, enveloping the buildings and drifting familiarly across the wide acres of colony land. In the shadows, little Mike caught sight of Volkner's car standing alongside a commune home. Strange that it had been there all evening and all day, and that only now he seemed to notice it. The boys had been warned to stay away from it, but there was no rule against looking as he looked now, straining his eyes until his imagination carried him across the yard and set him down inside, behind its glowing windows. He was reluctant to stay there even in his thoughts, for it was not a happy prospect to be carried out into the world. Yet in his inmost heart he wanted to go, even though he was afraid. Now he imagined that as he sat crouched in the car, Joshua Volkner came to take his place at the wheel. Volkner was car boss, and wherever he willed that the car should go, there it went, and Volkner was saying, "Come along with me, little Mike." "Where to?" "Over the river and out across the commune lines, far from the colony and the safe protection of the commune yard, far away from everyone he trusted and loved, from Michael father and the pastor and the elders, from Sarah mother and his sisters and the boys he knew, far away from all that was good, out into all that was bad, so far away that he could no longer hear the commune sounds. Or the singing of the old hymns at evening time. He snuggled against his mother and said half aloud, "Go away, Mr. Worldling, go away." Sarah trembled as if to shake off his words. There was a long stillness as sometimes fell over the commune grounds. Then could be heard the squeak of a long-handled baby cart as a mother walked slowly to her home, pulling a child while leading another by the hand. Night sounds began to creep in from the fields, as if warning that it was time for the kerosene lamps to be lighted in the windows. But Sarah sat on the house bench knitting, waiting with contrite heart the ending of another day, as Hutarian women had done in Old Portage Colony for 75 years. "Sarah, mother, why did Joshua Volkner leave the commune 20 years ago?" "Who knows that?" "But why did he? Was it because he wanted to marry the girl from the outside?" "It was the world," said Sarah shortly. Then she shrugged. "But he wishes now he could come back. That anyone can tell just by looking at him." "How? How what? How can you tell?" "What has the world but trouble?" Sarah demanded, fortifying her own thoughts. "Wars and sin and private ownership. And the other that Michael father said too. What? Face painting and hair fixing and all that." "Oh, that," Sarah retorted impatiently, "that is most foolish of all. "It is," little Mike agreed, "because you are pretty even when the sunset paint is gone. You are pretty as the calendar picture was." "Silly," said Sarah. "Poor Joshua Volkner." Little Mike sighed. "With his chin on his knees, and his father and mother are far away in a commune in Canada. Will he go to see them?" "He telephoned to them," somebody said. Sarah admitted, "They have a telephone in that colony." "If I would ever not see you and Michael father for even a day, I would be very sad," little Mike told her. "You just be good," said Sarah. "How many communes are there in Canada, Sarah mother?" "About 30. And 9 here in America," little Mike announced in a voice of wonder. "I will be glad for the day when a new colony starts. I heard the householder say that it might be soon, for we are nearly 200 here. And when there are 200, that's time to start a new place." I told Jake Linder that if always new colonies began, someday the whole world will be Hutterian. Wouldn't that be wonderful, Sarah mother, to have the whole world Hutterian? And if the whole world would be Hutterian, Joshua Volkner could not run away because there would be no place for him to run to. And to marry, he could marry a Hutterian, and he should have done that in the first place. Michael father just as good as told him. Sarah's fingers moved the needles ever more slowly. Soon they rested in her lap. The figures that moved through the commune yard were now part of the shadows, veiled in the darkness along with her thoughts. Evening had a way of gathering up half-forgotten memories and bringing them from the many tranquil corners of the commune back to their owners for the night. Could the boy sitting at her side know what she was thinking? Was it 20 years ago, that autumn night, after evensong, when the pastor walked menacingly through the commune yard and stopped the choremen with a question, firmly asking the farm boss and the cattle boss and the elders, "When did you see him last? What did he say to you?" Was it 20 years ago that Joshua's parents sat in their rooms as parents sat tonight? He was at supper, wasn't he? He must have gone during church time. He didn't leave a note, not a word, nothing. It's the world. They all said it was the world. Sarah Newman, Michael's bride of 3 days, was sitting on a house bench that night knitting. Michael was working in the cabinet shop. And now, as Sarah remembered, she leaned back against the house and closed her eyes. She stretched herself until her foot touched the cradle, Leah's cradle, Mary's, Anna's, little Mike's, Ruth's, Rachel's. It should have been little Sarah's too. She would never forget that night, the moving, searching lanterns swinging in the hands of those who hunted through the quarries and the fields, those who would not bring themselves to believe that Joshua had run away. Plans were being made to drag the river when the news spread that a note had been found. Joshua had left a note concealed beneath the hymnal in his parents' room. "I am going into the world. Do not worry about me." The children who talked about it were sharply rebuked. Women gathered in groups in the commune yard. The men milled around the pastor's home, armed with parables and axioms from the wisdom of the past. Sarah remembered how Michael came from the shop that night very late and found her sitting on the house bench. Breathlessly she watched him approach. She remembered the sound of his shoes in the yard, the sight of the shadowy figure swinging his arms, the ominous movement with which he dropped down beside her, and she thanked God that the night hid her face from him. She recalled the tense moment before he spoke, the eternity of waiting while he leaned back against the house, tilted his hat over his eyes, and thrust his hands into his pockets. What a thing to do! He has turned his back on all of us and spit into God's face. I stopped in to see Adrian and Martha Volkner. There they sit with their other children. One black sheep cannot spoil 6 whites, the cattle boss said, but there the poor parents sit, and there's nothing to say. There's nothing to do. He could have been farm boss some day, just as I will be carpenter boss, if I do good work and the elders agree on it. He wants the world, so we will let him go. Goodbye, Joshua Volkner, goodbye to you. They sat together for a long time that night, while Michael philosophized and consigned Joshua to the judgment. He never asked Sarah for her opinion. He had the say, and she was glad for that. She was glad that the families which moved about the commune yard that night kept saying, "He'll come back," but Michael spoke of him as one who had died. Vividly she recalled how they went into the new quarters, and how Michael scratched the match on the bottom of the table and lighted the kerosene lamp. His face was dark, with a 3-day growth of beard. In keeping with colony tradition, he had let his beard grow from the day of their marriage. Resolutely he hung his black hat on a peg. Joshua is gone, it's the world. The bait hides the hook. The devil's long, lean fingers have finally come in between the wires of the commune fence. Joshua is gone. She remembered how he looked at her with a love he never seemed to express, a love that was deep and compassionate behind his matter-of-fact and sometimes boastful manner. They got ready for bed, and Michael knelt down to pray. He prayed long and earnestly, telling God all about Adrian and Martha Volkner, who had lost a son. He assured him that the Michael Newman family, through the years, would keep the commune gate secure, and he prayed for Joshua, lost and roaming, homeless and alone. There was no song after the prayer that night, and Sarah was thankful, for she wanted only to lie quietly in the feather bed in the dark, while her thoughts ran wantonly out into the world. Wildly they carried her far beyond the reach of prayers or songs, but always she returned with the knowledge that family clasping her hand was the one she had promised to love and serve and obey until she died. Little Mike was speaking. "Look, Sarah Mother, how big and bright the moon is coming up. Pastor Kunz calls it the lantern of God. He says it is always shining somewhere, even if we don't see it in the commune, just as God is always everywhere, even if we don't see him." The moon rose majestically, showering the commune with peace. Little Mike felt a secret joy, so secure that the far distant hum of an automobile made him laugh to himself. No car could ever lure him away, not even Joshua Volkner's. The full glow of the moon was showing him what was good: the barns, the cows in the fenced-in yard, the unpainted chalk-block houses, the shops, and the little school where evensong had been held. Was Joshua Volkner really a boy in the commune, as I am, Sarah Mother? "What are all these silly questions tonight?" Sarah demanded, winding the knitting around the needles. "That's all past. Who knows the way things go, or what can happen to anybody? Didn't a boy in a Canada colony run away during the war because he wanted to be a soldier? He was killed," little Mike interrupted. "Yes, he was killed. God's punishment. Wasn't it It's God's punishment because war is wrong. Don't always ask questions and always have your own ideas about things. Go to bed where boys like you should be anyhow. The trees were lovely in the moonlight, and the roof of the big barn was trimmed with silver. A bat swirled around the house wall where they sat. It flew so close to little Mike he could feel the stirring breath of its wings. Sarah sat with face inscrutable, her eyes absently following the erratic flight. Little Mike's voice was hushed. I remember what James the teacher said. A bat will never touch you or fly against you. Still it cannot see at all. It has feelings. God put something in its nature that guides it. Sarah reached down to pick up the knitting pail. Did Joshua Volkner say how long he will stay? He'll go tomorrow because he has business in Yankton. After that he goes back to Chicago, Sarah mused. He has only 2 children, little Mike explained. His wife has a lot of money. Michael father asked him if she had much money, and he said yes. Michael father asked him if that was why he married her, and he said no. Sarah stiffened. The householder told Michael father afterwards that it would be just as good if Joshua Volkner did not stay here too long. Little Mike hurried on. He's living the way he wants to live, and we're living the way we want to. America is big enough for all of us. That's what the householder said. America is big, Sarah Mother. Our river runs 1,000 miles upstream and 1,000 miles down, but it is best right here where it comes through our land. He raised his eyes to glance at his mother, for her fingers had covered his hand gently. How his heart leaped when he felt her caress! How jealously the moon shone on her, and how beautifully the light sparkled around her. It was almost daylight, it was so bright, and the moonlight brought back Joshua Volkner's car. When he saw it, a sense of sadness for Joshua returned. The worldling had come back, and no one was anxious that he stay. His brothers and sisters and his father and mother had long ago given him up. Would they want to see him even today if he went to visit them? They would never cover his hand as Sarah Mother covered his. They would never sit together in the shelter of the commune as his mother and he were sitting now. Poor Joshua Volkner. Sarah, with an exasperated, fluttering motion, got up. It's high time you went to bed, she ordered. Bring the cradle and come along. She went quickly into the house. Little Mike sat for a moment with his chin on his knees. How plainly he could hear the voices from within. Sarah, Joshua Volkner sleeps in the children's room, and they sleep with us. Little Mike can find a place on the floor. That's good for him. Everything is taken care of, Michael, Sarah assured him. Rachel and Ruth are staying with Rebecca Mueller. There's plenty of room. After all, Joshua Volkner knows how life is in the colony. That I surely do, Sarah Newman. But, Michael, how much easier life would be for your women if the elders could only be persuaded to put in a few conveniences, running water, electricity. And how much better life would be for women in the world, Michael retorted, if they just had fewer conveniences and a little more responsibility. Don't start to make comparisons between your world and ours, because in such an argument you haven't got a chance. If you pound too hard an anvil, you'll only break your hammer. Happily, little Mike jumped down from the house bench, picked up the cradle and put it over his head. Now he played that he was in a cage, but a cage that he could discard or press down harder, whichever he willed. Through the smooth round spindles he could see the moon and the commune. He could see Rachel and David Weiss walking together near David's home. Little Mike walked around, too, so that he could see the house benches and the outline of people who sat quietly and the forms of people who moved in the yard. Through his make-believe prison, looking this way and that, wandering here and there, he was possessor of all that he beheld, and as he passed a house he heard a family singing, "Once more, O God, we near the end of day. The darksome night again is hovering over us." He twisted and turned his bare feet playfully in the cool dirt of the commune yard, joining the song, singing half to himself, half to the cradle, making sure that Faulkner's automobile could see for itself that he was not one bit afraid of it, not any more than Michael Father was afraid of the Angus steer. Then, laughing at the eerie shadows of himself, he went forward, humming the song with a happy heart. Brightly before him the lamp was burning in his father's house.